As tokenized real-world assets scale, what execution constraints do you think secondary markets will require, and where does Bancor technology fit into that picture?
Let me elaborate on the question a little bit to point out that for many real world assets, the idea that everything should be permissionless and or anonymous completely flies in the face of how that financial instrument is regulated in wherever that financial instrument was created. It's very, very likely there will be constraints on how certain RWAs behave on chain. So for example, think back to DeFi 1.0, people just create a liquidity pool and now it's there and anyone can create that liquidity pool. And now the liquidity pool exists, anyone can trade tokens with it and so on. That's fine because none of the tokens that existed in that era were strictly regulated assets. With RWAs, when they come on chain, the tokens that represent those assets will probably inherit the policy that governs them in the real world. The fact that they're now tokens doesn't exempt them from their regulatory status. So what does that mean for DeFi? What does it mean for Bancor technology? The way that carbon contracts are constructed are deliberately agnostic to those kinds of things. I think it's going to come down to the token level. So a good friend of mine once showed me a design that he had for creating regulation-aware wrappers of tokens. So you could, for example, have a real-world asset that's been tokenized and just issue it as a plain ERC20. Then put it through a wrapper contract that creates a compliant version of that ERC20 that would instill things like KYC properties or like travel rule tracing features to that wrapped token. And that would mean if you put it into a DeFi protocol like Carbon, when people are interacting with Carbon, the permissions to trade that token now exist at the token level. So someone who isn't on that whitelist hasn't got permissions to buy or trade that specific RWA token version, would then be prohibited from doing so. I think that's kind of what it's going to look like. We've seen things like Aave Arc, which was kind of an institutional compliant version of Aave that was developed. And I think that was a really good forward-looking experiment by Aave. But I also think this idea of having to splinter every protocol and have one that is permissioned and one that's permissionless is probably a bad design paradigm. I think what we will see is either this kind of wrapping concept that I described, or just have non-standard ERC20s where the permissions are built directly into the token contract become more commonplace. So in that sense, just because it's a much more elegant design principle, I think we'll see those kinds of things begin to dominate. And because the Bancor contracts are already agnostic to that kind of stuff, it will operate perfectly well under those kinds of constraints. So that's how I think it's going to go down. Now, what does that mean for the secondary markets? I think for on-chain stuff, it's going to look basically the same as it does in the off-chain markets. There are some assets that you need to have certain credentials to trade with. And if you're doing it on-chain, you're going to need to have those credentials as well. I don't think we should expect the secondary market to really notice or care in those specific circumstances.